When you think of France, what comes to mind? The Eiffel Tower? Delicious baguettes? Or perhaps a proud, storied history dating back to the time of kings and revolutions? But what if I told you that beneath the romance and grandeur, French DNA holds secrets that even the most passionate historians didn't anticipate? Here's a question. How French is France? Really? You might think you know the answer, but modern genetic research is uncovering truths that could flip everything you thought you knew about French identity on its head. Did you know that the average French person's DNA has traces of ancient Viking warriors, Roman settlers, and even populations from North Africa and the Middle East? France, the heart of European culture, is more than just its landmarks and traditions. It's a living mosaic of people shaped by waves of migration, invasion, and exchange spanning thousands of years. The French you know today are connected to a web of ancient populations, from the Celts to the Moors, each leaving behind genetic breadcrumbs that reveal a much more diverse and fascinating story than you'd expect. So, what do these genetic breadcrumbs tell us about the people of France? How have centuries of migrations and conquests shaped not just the borders, but the very DNA of its population? And what surprising discoveries might still be hiding in plain sight? Stick around, because today, we're diving deep into the extraordinary and unexpected secrets buried in French DNA. To truly understand the secrets hidden in French DNA, we need to start with the basics. What exactly can DNA tell us about history? DNA, often called the blueprint of life, contains the genetic instructions that make us who we are. But here's the fascinating part. It's also a time capsule. Within our DNA are markers that connect us to ancient populations, migrations, and even events like the spread of agriculture or the fall of empires. Every strand of DNA carries a story, and in the case of the French people, it's a story rich with complexity and cultural exchange. Let's zoom out for a moment. Imagine Europe as a massive crossroads, especially during ancient times. At the center of it all lies France, bordered by the Atlantic Ocean to the west, the Mediterranean to the south, and neighboring countries like Spain, Germany, and Italy. Because of its location, France was a major meeting point for different groups of people over thousands of years. Now, consider the layers of history in France. It wasn't always the France we know today. Long before there was a Paris, there were prehistoric hunter-gatherers roaming its forests and plains. Then came waves of new peoples. The Celts, the Romans, the Franks, the Vikings, and each of them left a genetic fingerprint. But it doesn't stop there. France's history is also shaped by trade, colonization, and even brief occupations. Every interaction between populations, from peaceful exchanges to full-scale invasions, left subtle changes in the DNA of the people living there. Here's an example. Did you know that the French share ancient genetic ties to populations as far away as Central Asia? How is that possible? Well, as we'll explore later, migration and trade routes like the ancient Silk Road played a surprising role in shaping genetic diversity across Europe. So, what makes French DNA so unique? It's the way these layers of history overlap and interact, creating a genetic mosaic that's as rich and diverse as France's culture itself. In the next section, we'll peel back the first of these layers and uncover the ancient roots of French DNA. Starting with the people who called this land home thousands of years before the word France even existed. Before France became the France we know today, a land of castles, revolutions, and art, it was home to some of Europe's earliest settlers. To truly understand French DNA, we need to dig deep, all the way back to its prehistoric roots. Around 40,000 years ago, modern humans, or Homo sapiens, began arriving in what is now France. These were some of Europe's first hunter-gatherers, people who lived off the land, hunting game and foraging for plants. Genetic evidence shows that they were closely related to other Paleolithic populations across Europe. These ancient humans laid the groundwork for the genetic legacy that would shape the region for millennia. But here's where it gets interesting. About 7,000 years ago, a new wave of people arrived in France. These were early farmers from the Near East, bringing with them not just agriculture, but new genetic markers. They intermingled with the existing hunter-gatherer populations, creating a blend of genes that still exists in modern Europeans, including the French. Fast forward a few thousand years, and we encounter one of the most iconic ancient groups to shape France, the Celts. Known to the Romans as the Gauls, these Iron Age tribes dominated much of what is now France around 1000 BCE. The Celts left a significant cultural and genetic legacy, especially in regions like Brittany, where their influence is still felt today. What makes the Celts fascinating is their wide reach. They weren't just confined to France. They spread across much of Europe, from Spain to the British Isles and beyond. Genetic studies show that people in Brittany share more DNA with the Welsh and Irish than with other French regions, highlighting the deep Celtic connections across these lands. But the story doesn't stop there. Around 52 BCE, everything changed with the arrival of the Romans. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul brought a wave of Roman settlers and soldiers, particularly to southern France. This introduced Mediterranean genes into the French gene pool, especially in areas like Provence, which still shows stronger genetic ties to Italy than the northern parts of the country. What's truly fascinating is how these ancient populations, the hunter-gatherers, the early farmers, the Celts, and the Romans, all contributed to the foundation of French DNA. Their genetic fingerprints overlap, creating a complex and dynamic story that's still being unraveled by scientists today. But these are just the earliest chapters in France's genetic history. In the next section, we'll explore how waves of invaders and migrants, Vikings, Franks, and even Moors, added new layers to this already intricate tapestry. France's genetic story becomes even more fascinating when we look at the waves of invaders and migrants that arrived after the Roman Empire. These groups didn't just reshape the country's culture and politics. They also left their mark on French DNA, creating an even richer genetic mosaic. Let's start with the Franks. After the fall of Rome in the 5th century, the Franks, a Germanic tribe, established themselves as the dominant power in what is now northern France. They even gave the country its name. France comes from Frank. Genetic studies show that northern France has stronger links to Germanic populations, thanks to the Franks and other tribes like the Burgundians. This is why northern French people often have genetic markers that trace back to Central and Eastern Europe. But the Franks were just the beginning. In the 9th and 10th centuries, France faced another wave of invaders, the Vikings. These Scandinavian raiders were known for their daring expeditions, and they didn't just stop at pillaging. Many of them settled in northern France, particularly in a region that would come to be known as Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen. Here's an incredible fact. Modern DNA studies reveal that people in Normandy today carry clear genetic traces of their Viking ancestors. This is especially evident in their Y chromosome markers, which are passed down from father to son. It's a reminder of how even short periods of migration or settlement can leave a lasting impact on a population's genetic makeup. Now, let's travel south to the Mediterranean coast. In the early Middle Ages, parts of southern France experienced brief occupations by Muslim forces, often referred to as the Moors. While their time in France was limited, their presence introduced new cultural and genetic influences. Today, genetic markers from North Africa and the Middle East can still be found in the DNA of people in southern France. But migration wasn't always about conquest. France's location at the heart of Europe made it a hub for trade and cultural exchange. For centuries, merchants, travelers, and even enslaved people moved through France, adding their genetic threads to the tapestry. One fascinating example of this diversity is the genetic links between southern France and regions as far away as the Middle East and North Africa. These connections likely stem from trade routes that crisscrossed the Mediterranean during the medieval period. What's remarkable is how all these layers, Germanic tribes, Vikings, Moors, and countless others, combined to shape the DNA of modern France. Each group brought something new, creating a genetic heritage that's as diverse as the country's landscapes and traditions. But the surprises don't stop here. In the next section, we'll zoom in on France's regions to uncover the striking genetic differences that make each part of the country unique. When we think of France, it's easy to picture a unified nation, rich in culture and history. But beneath the surface lies a fascinating reality. France isn't genetically uniform. In fact, the DNA of its people varies significantly from region to region, reflecting centuries of migrations, invasions, and unique local histories. Let's begin in Brittany, a region in the northwest that stands apart both culturally and genetically. Brittany's residents have strong ties to Celtic ancestry, more so than almost any other part of France. DNA studies reveal that the people of Brittany share more genetic markers with populations in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland than with their neighbors in central France. This is because Brittany was settled by Celtic tribes, and later, migrants from the British Isles, preserving a distinct Celtic legacy that endures to this day. Next, let's travel to Normandy in northern France. As we mentioned earlier, Normandy carries the unmistakable genetic imprint of its Viking past. Here, you'll find a higher concentration of Scandinavian DNA, especially in the Y chromosome markers. This connection to the Norse settlers who arrived over 1,000 years ago is a living reminder of the region's unique history. Now, let's move south to Occitania, a region that includes parts of southern France. The DNA of this area reflects its Mediterranean connections, with stronger ties to Italy, Greece, and even North Africa. This makes sense when you consider the region's history as a crossroads for trade and cultural exchange across the Mediterranean. Southern France also carries subtle genetic markers from the Moorish presence during the early Middle Ages, adding another layer of diversity to the mix. Then there's the Basque region, nestled in the Pyrenees Mountains along the border with Spain. The Basque people are one of the most genetically distinct groups in Europe. Their DNA shows unique markers that suggest they descend from some of Europe's earliest inhabitants, long before the arrival of agriculture. This makes the Basques a genetic time capsule, offering a glimpse into a population that has remained largely isolated for thousands of years. Central and eastern France, meanwhile, show a different story. These areas are influenced by the Franks and other Germanic tribes, creating a genetic profile that ties them closer to populations in Germany and the Low Countries. This region reflects the legacy of the early medieval kingdoms that formed the backbone of what would eventually become modern France. Finally, let's not forget the Alps. Some remote villages in the French Alps have remarkably preserved ancient genetic markers due to their relative isolation. These communities offer a window into the genetic makeup of France from centuries ago, largely untouched by the waves of migration and change that swept through other parts of the country. What's incredible about these regional variations is how they paint a picture of France as a nation of nations, a place where local histories and identities are woven into the larger story of the country. From Celtic Brittany to Viking Normandy, from Mediterranean Occitania to ancient Basque lands, French DNA tells a story of diversity and interconnectedness. In the next section, we'll tackle one of the biggest misconceptions about French identity and explore how the myth of purity contrasts with the scientific reality of genetic diversity. For centuries, the idea of a pure French identity has been a cornerstone of national pride and cultural narratives. But modern genetic research tells us a very different story, one that challenges the notion of purity and reveals the rich, diverse origins of the French people. Let's start by examining where the myth of French purity comes from. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, as France became a modern nation-state, the idea of a unified, singular French identity was promoted for political reasons. Nationalists sought to create a shared narrative that downplayed regional differences and emphasized a homogeneous French culture. This myth was particularly strong during times of war and conflict, when a sense of unity was essential for national morale. However, science doesn't care about political narratives. Genetic studies have shown that the French population is anything but homogeneous. Instead, France is one of the most genetically diverse nations in Europe, shaped by thousands of years of migration, trade, and conquest. For example, the northern regions of France have genetic ties to Germanic populations like the Franks, while the south carries markers linked to Mediterranean and North African groups. Meanwhile, the western regions, like Brittany, are steeped in Celtic heritage, and the Basque region stands as one of the most unique genetic populations in all of Europe. This diversity isn't a weakness, it's a strength. It tells the story of a nation that has thrived at the crossroads of civilizations. But the myth of purity has sometimes been used to exclude or marginalize certain groups, particularly those with more recent ties to migration. By embracing the reality of genetic diversity, we can challenge outdated ideas of identity and celebrate the true complexity of what it means to be French. Here's a striking example. A genetic study published in the past decade revealed that modern French people share DNA with populations as far away as the Middle East and Central Asia. How is that possible? The answer lies in centuries of trade, migration, and cultural exchange that connected Europe to the wider world. These genetic connections remind us that identity is fluid, not fixed. Moreover, the idea of purity falls apart when we consider that every human carries traces of migrations and mixtures from across the globe. For instance, the average French person's genome contains contributions from prehistoric hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, Indo-European migrants, and more. No population exists in isolation, and the French are no exception. But there's another important takeaway here. Understanding the genetic diversity of France isn't just about the past. It's about shaping the future. By recognizing the diverse roots of its people, France can continue to celebrate its cultural richness while fostering inclusion and unity. In the next section, we'll dive into some of the most surprising and fun discoveries about French DNA, from unique genetic quirks to unexpected links to far-off places. Get ready for some jaw-dropping revelations. French DNA is full of surprises, and scientists continue to uncover remarkable discoveries that shed light on the country's genetic diversity. Some of these findings are unexpected, others are outright mind-blowing. Let's dive into the most fascinating revelations. First, let's talk about regional quirks. Did you know that certain villages in rural France have populations whose DNA has barely changed for centuries? For example, studies in the Pyrenees show isolated communities with genetic markers that date back to the early Middle Ages. These communities provide a unique glimpse into the genetic past of Europe, preserved in almost pristine condition. And then there's the Basque region, straddling the border between France and Spain. The Basque people are genetically distinct from other Europeans, with markers that suggest they are descended from some of Europe's earliest inhabitants, long before the arrival of farming populations. This uniqueness has made the Basque a subject of fascination for scientists trying to piece together the story of Europe's prehistory. But French DNA isn't just about isolated populations. It's also a story of surprising connections. For instance, researchers have found genetic links between certain French populations and regions as far away as Central Asia. How is that possible? One explanation is ancient trade networks, like the Silk Road, which facilitated the movement of people and goods across vast distances. One particularly surprising discovery involved genetic markers in southern France that trace back to Phoenician traders from the eastern Mediterranean. The Phoenicians, known for their seafaring and trading, established colonies across the Mediterranean, and their influence even reached French shores. Today, subtle traces of their DNA can still be found in coastal regions like Provence. But the surprises don't end there. In Normandy, genetic evidence reveals a clear Viking legacy. While this might not be shocking, after all, the Vikings famously settled in northern France. What's fascinating is how strong their genetic impact remains. Modern Normans carry more Scandinavian DNA than many other populations in France, a testament to the enduring influence of these fierce seafarers. Another fascinating aspect of French DNA is how it reflects ancient migration routes. For example, populations in the Rhône Valley, which follows the path of the Rhône River, show genetic markers tied to the movement of people from the Mediterranean into Central Europe. Rivers, as it turns out, weren't just highways for trade. They were also key pathways for human migration and genetic exchange. And let's not forget the quirks. Did you know that some French people carry rare genetic markers that are almost absent elsewhere in Europe? For instance, certain markers found in alpine regions suggest a link to ancient nomadic groups from the Eurasian steppe. These markers might reflect migrations that occurred thousands of years ago, long before recorded history. Finally, one of the most heartwarming discoveries about French DNA is how interconnected it is with the rest of Europe. Studies show that despite regional differences, French populations share strong genetic ties with their neighbors, from the British Isles to Spain, Italy, and Germany. This interconnectedness underscores the shared history of Europe and reminds us that national borders are, in many ways, a recent invention. The study of French DNA is more than just a scientific endeavor. It's a journey into the heart of what it means to be human. And as researchers continue to analyze genetic data, who knows what new secrets will be uncovered? In the next section, we'll explore how these discoveries about French DNA have modern implications, from medical research to redefining how we think about identity and heritage. Understanding the secrets hidden in French DNA isn't just about uncovering the past. It's about shaping the future. The implications of these genetic discoveries are profound, influencing everything from modern medicine to how we view identity in an increasingly globalized world. Let's start with medical research. Genetic studies of French populations are helping scientists identify patterns in DNA that affect health and disease. For instance, certain regional genetic markers in France are linked to unique predispositions for conditions like cardiovascular disease, cancer, or rare genetic disorders. By studying these markers, researchers can develop targeted treatments and improve precision medicine, tailoring healthcare to the specific needs of different populations. One example comes from studies of isolated French communities, such as those in the Pyrenees or Alpine regions. These populations often have higher rates of specific genetic traits due to centuries of relative isolation. While this can lead to an increased risk of certain inherited conditions, it also provides scientists with invaluable data for understanding how genes influence health. French DNA is also shedding light on migration patterns and the movement of people across Europe. By mapping genetic markers across different regions, researchers can reconstruct the paths that ancient populations took as they spread through the continent. This doesn't just add to our understanding of history, it also helps us better understand the genetic connections between modern populations. But beyond the scientific implications, there's a deeper cultural message in all of this: the idea that identity is complex and multifaceted. For centuries, national narratives often focused on the idea of a single, unified heritage. But DNA tells a different story, a story of diversity, blending, and shared humanity. French DNA, with its mix of Celtic, Roman, Germanic, Viking, and Mediterranean influences, is a perfect example of this. It shows that no population is static or isolated. Instead, we are all shaped by centuries of migration, interaction, and cultural exchange. This understanding has powerful implications for how we think about modern identity. In a world where questions of immigration and multiculturalism often dominate the political discourse, genetics offers a reminder that no nation is truly pure. The story of French DNA is the story of a people enriched by their connections to others, a story that applies not just to France, but to every corner of the globe. So, what does this mean for the future? It means embracing diversity as a strength, not a threat. It means using the lessons of history, revealed through DNA, to build a more inclusive and connected world. And it means celebrating the idea that our differences are what make us stronger, not weaker. In our final section, we'll wrap up this journey through French DNA with a recap of the key points and a reflection on what it all means for our shared human story. Stick around. You won't want to miss the conclusion. As we reach the end of our journey into the secrets of French DNA, one thing becomes clear. The story written in DNA is far richer, more complex, and more surprising than anyone could have imagined. We began by uncovering the ancient roots of French DNA, tracing back to Europe's first hunter-gatherers and the arrival of early farmers from the Near East. We saw how the Celts or Gauls left their indelible mark on French identity, and how the Roman conquest brought Mediterranean genes to the southern regions of France. From there, we explored the waves of invaders and migrants who added new layers to this genetic tapestry. The Franks, whose legacy is even reflected in France's name. The Vikings, who settled in Normandy and left traces of their Scandinavian heritage. And the Moors, whose brief but impactful presence shaped the genetic diversity of southern France. We also discovered the fascinating regional differences in French DNA. From Brittany's Celtic heritage to Normandy's Viking roots, from the Mediterranean influences in Provence to the unique genetic identity of the Basque people. It's clear that France is not a single genetic story. It's a mosaic of countless intertwining narratives. But perhaps the most profound takeaway is how French DNA challenges the myth of purity. Modern genetics reveals a France that has always been a melting pot, shaped by migration, exchange, and cultural blending. This is a powerful reminder that no nation or population exists in isolation, and that our shared human story is one of connection and diversity. So why does this matter? Because understanding our genetic history isn't just about the past. It's about the present and the future. It's about embracing the idea that our differences are what make us unique, and that our connections are what make us strong. French DNA, with its rich mix of ancient and modern influences, offers a powerful example of how humanity thrives through diversity. It tells us that identity is not fixed or rigid. It's fluid, dynamic, and constantly evolving. As we close, I want to leave you with a question. What part of this story surprised you the most? Was it the Viking legacy in Normandy, the Celtic connections to Brittany, or maybe the surprising links to places as far away as North Africa and Central Asia? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the secrets of French DNA, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with a friend who loves history, science, or the unexpected connections that make us who we are. Because at the end of the day, no matter where we come from, our DNA reminds us of one simple truth. We are all part of a much bigger story, one that unites us in ways we're only beginning to understand. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you in the next video.